Hello, Swaroop here. Welcome to another tutorial in the C programming series. In the last tutorial, we have seen what functions are in C programming, and in this tutorial, we'll create a function and we'll use that function to see how that works in C. Just as a quick recap for what we have covered in the last tutorial, these are the four pieces of information that a function needs. First is a name. Second, the body, that is what the function does. And number three is the parameters or the arguments that you pass into the function. And finally, the return type, what this function returns. And by the way, a function can return only one value at a time, whether it returns an integer or a character or a string or an array or any other variable. It can only return one value at a time. You can also have a function that doesn't return anything, which we call it as a void return type. So that's a quick recap of what we have covered in the previous tutorial. And a function structure looks like this. You'll have a return type, a name, the parameters, and the body. So we'll use this and we'll create a function in this tutorial, taking the same example that we had before, that is to find the maximum of two numbers. Now, the first thing you should be asking yourself is, alright, we'll create a function to replace this piece of code that we've been talking about, but where should we create this function? Where should we put it? Should this be inside main in this area? Well, no, because main is already a function, and in C programming, you can't have a function inside a function, so it can't be inside main, so not in here. So it has to be outside main. So let's start with putting it above main. You can also put the function below main, that is here, but there are a couple of things you have to take care when you do that, which we will cover a bit later. So for now, let's just add the function here. The first thing it needs is the name, and since we're trying to calculate the maximum and the two numbers, so let's just call it maximum. All right. And since it's a function, you'll have the parentheses. And the next thing is the return type. So return type goes before the name, that is here. Now you can have this function return anything you want. So for now, let's just not have anything returned. So let's make it a void return type. So you'll have a void and the name of the function. And then you'll have a body in between these two curly brackets. Now, the arguments or the parameters. So what do you have in here? Now, since we're trying to find the maximum of two numbers, it makes sense to pass those two values as arguments. The way you declare something, you define arguments, is by typing its type and the name. So since we're trying to pass two numbers which are integers, we'll say int n1 and int n2. Now, notice that I've given the names as n1 and n2, not num1, num2. The names you give here, that is n1, n2, have nothing to do with these two names. You can give them anything you want. These names doesn't have to be the same as the names you have given here. All right, you can call them anything you want. And for the body, we'll just copy this and put it here because that's what we have to do, right? And by the way, here it's not num1 anymore, it's n1. So we'll make this n1 and this would be n2, and same here, n1 and n2, right? So that's what this function does. And in the end, let's just print the max value. So I'll just say max and we'll print that. So that would be this. So that's what this function does. It takes two numbers and it checks which is greater than the other one and prints that, right? Makes sense. Now the way you use that here in the main, because obviously we want to replace this, so we'll just comment this for now. So we can do this, and the way you use this function is by typing its name and passing the parameters. So in our case, num1 and num2. So what this means is that this num1, which is 10, will be passed to this function as n1. So inside this, n1 will have the value 10 because num1 is 10, the first parameter, and then the second parameter would be 12, and so n2 would be 12, right? So we can actually run this. So let's just comment out this second half of it and run this. And as you can see, the maximum is 12, which makes sense because 12 is greater than 10. So it's fine. But now if you notice, let me just uncomment this again. Here we were adding 1 to max, right? But we don't have max anymore. The max only exists in this function, and since it's in a different function, this variable is not available in this function. Max is not present in this block. So here we are calling the maximum function with these two values, and the maximum is calculating this and printing it, but it's not returning anything, and hence the return type void. So even though the maximum function is calculating the value, it's not returning anything back to you. So at this point here, when you've called it, even though the maximum function knows which is the greatest between the two numbers, you don't know that. So you can't use that value in this case because max is not present anymore and you don't know what the maximum is. So to fix this, what we'll do is we'll change the return type to integer. That is, we'll return something which would be the max. So instead of just saying print here, I'll make it return max. Right? So this function now is returning a value. It's not just computing and keeping it to itself. It's figuring out what the maximum value is and giving it back to you. So now you have the value here, and the way you get the value from the function is by putting it into a variable. So you can do something like this: int max is the maximum that it returns. Now you might be wondering, wouldn't the max here and the max here create a clash because they have the same name? But no. In C we have something called as a scope, which we will cover in the next video. But for now, all you have to know is that the max here and the max here are different because they are in two different functions. This is in maximum function and this is in the main function. So they are treated differently. So you don't have to worry about having a name clash. So now, since we have the value of the maximum, which in our case would be 12 because 12 is greater than 10, and that will be present in maximum, so you can use that later on. So this new number 1 will now have 12 plus 1, so that would be 13, and this will have 10 plus 12, which is 22. So the maximum of these two numbers should be 22. And again, since we can replace this, so we'll just remove that and call maximum of new num1 and new num2, right? Now let's store that into another variable called new max. So this is the maximum between these two numbers, which would be 22. So let's just print that. So print, let's say new max, and we'll do that. So now we have the maximum between these two values, and we can also remove this part. It's not needed anymore. So now if we run this, we should get 22, and that's what we get because 13 is less than 22, and we're good. So this is how the functions work in C. So you can see that the code has become much more concise and more easier to understand since we have abstracted this part out into a function. So this looks much cleaner now. So with that, we can come back to what I was telling you in the beginning regarding why I've put this function above main and not below it. So as you know, C compiler compiles from the top line by line. So it starts with line number 1, then line number 2, 3, and so on. So in this program, when it comes all the way to the line 20 here, and when it sees the maximum, it already knows what the maximum function is. So it knows that it returns a type int. It also knows that it takes 2 arguments of type int as well. So it has all the information it needs when it comes to this line in this program. But now imagine if you put this below, that is after main, so now when the C compiler is checking, when it comes to line 7, it has no idea what this maximum function is. Now you might say it has been declared here, but till this point it hasn't encountered the function maximum and it doesn't know what it is. So in a case like this, the compiler tries to assume what this function might look like. Most of the time it ends up with a wrong assumption, which can lead to errors and unexpected behavior. So to prevent this, what we'll do is we'll have to put something called as a function prototype before main, indicating that there is a function that you have to know about. So the way you do it, at least for this function, would be just to copy this and to place it here on top with a semicolon at the end. So there is no body here. You just tell the compiler what the name is, what the return type is, and what the arguments are. That's all it needs to know. So this will tell the compiler that there is a function called maximum, which takes 2 parameters and it returns an integer. And with that, the compiler won't have to assume anything about this function because it already knows what this function looks like. So there won't be any issues in that case and everything works fine. If you want to put your functions at the end, that is after main, you have to add this, which we call as a function prototype or as a function signature. So this is needed if you want to put the function in the end. But if you want to put the function on the top, that is above main, then you won't need that prototype at all because it already knows everything it has to know about the function. So where you put your functions is purely a personal preference. Most of the people would like to have them in the end, as they would like to have main as the first function in the program, and I usually do that as well. So if I just have a couple of functions which are very small, I tend to put them on the top and have main after that. So it's up to you whether you want to put them on the top or at the bottom. If you want to put them in the end, you have to declare their prototypes, their signatures before that. But if you want to put the entire function before main, then you don't have to do anything else. So that's how you use functions in C. Functions are a really important topic to understand. So practice a lot and try to write your own functions, and only then you'll be able to understand all the details about functions. And in fact, if you remember, in one of our earliest tutorials, we did a calculator program which simply does an addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So take that program and try to add functions in that. So create a function that adds, and create a function for multiplication, create a function for subtraction, and another for division. That would be a good exercise for you to learn more about functions. So try that, and I hope that this tutorial was useful for you. So see you in the next tutorial. Until then, keep coding. Bye bye.